You're wasting our time, old man. We cater to actual buyers, not dirt-poor farmers looking for a free coffee and a warm place to sit. Those cruel words hung in the air as 72-year-old Frank Miller stood frozen in humiliation, his calloused hands gripping the keys to his weathered pickup truck. But 24 hours later, when a convoy of polished military vehicles rolled into the Pinnacle Automotive plaza, Richard Preston's smug expression crumbled as the decorated general who emerged introduced himself. "I'm General David Thompson, Joint Special Operations Command. Frank Miller saved my entire unit in Vietnam, and I believe we need to discuss your customer service practices before you sell another overpriced vehicle in this county. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Pinnacle Automotive stood as a gleaming monument to luxury in the heart of Cedar Springs, its modernist glass and steel structure rising from what had once been fertile farmland at the edge of town. The showroom's brilliant white floors and ambient lighting created the perfect backdrop for the imported vehicles on display, each one positioned on a slowly rotating platform as if it were a priceless work of art rather than a machine for transportation. The dealership had become the crown jewel of Preston Automotive Group, with locations in 3 states, but none quite as prestigious as this flagship store that had opened just 6 months earlier. The building itself had been featured in Architectural Digest, noted for how it boldly announces the arrival of cosmopolitan sophistication to a traditionally agricultural community. Local residents had mixed feelings about the dealership. Some welcomed the jobs and tax revenue, while others saw it as yet another sign of how quickly their farming community was transforming into something unrecognizable. Richard Preston, the 48-year-old owner, took particular pride in maintaining the dealership's exclusive atmosphere. With his custom-tailored suits and meticulously groomed appearance, he cultivated an air of sophisticated authority as he moved among his carefully selected clientele. He had built his reputation by transforming car buying from a tedious negotiation into what he called a premium acquisition experience for the region's growing professional class. His salespeople were instructed to identify potential buyers by their clothing, jewelry, and vehicles, focusing their attention on those who appeared most likely to make a purchase. The showroom reflected this philosophy. No garish banners announcing sales or financing options disrupted the clean lines of the space. Instead, subtle digital displays provided information about each vehicle's engineering excellence and luxury. Appointments. A small cafe area served espresso in fine porcelain cups, and a private consultation room featured leather furniture and ambient music for finalizing transactions. A discreet sign near the entrance stated, "By appointment recommended," though it wasn't strictly enforced for those who looked the part of a potential buyer. On a bright Tuesday morning in October, the showroom buzzed with quiet energy as sales associates guided potential customers through the features of various luxury models. Richard Preston stood near the central platform where the newest German sports sedan gleamed under perfectly positioned spotlights, its metallic silver paint catching the light as it slowly rotated. He was explaining the vehicle's hand-stitched leather interior to an interested couple when the main doors swung open, allowing a gust of autumn air to momentarily disrupt the showroom's climate-controlled perfection. Frank Miller stepped inside, temporarily blinded by the transition from bright sunlight to the showroom's carefully modulated lighting. At 72, his tall frame remained straight despite decades of physical labor, though he moved with the deliberate care of someone accustomed to pacing himself through long days of work. His faded blue jeans, well-worn work boots, and simple flannel shirt beneath an old canvas jacket marked him as plainly different from the showroom's typical visitors. As Frank's eyes adjusted to the light, he glanced around with quiet curiosity, taking in the sleek vehicles and minimalist decor. He removed his battered cap, revealing a full head of silver hair, and held it respectfully in weathered hands that bore the permanent stains and calluses of a lifetime working the soil. The elderly farmer didn't approach any of the vehicles immediately, instead standing just inside the entrance as he gathered his bearings. Preston noticed the newcomer and frowned slightly before returning his attention to the couple smoothly. Continuing his description of the sedan's engineering heritage, Frank meanwhile moved slowly toward a modestly priced entry-level model at the far corner of the showroom, examining it with thoughtful interest, occasionally bending to look more closely at various features. After concluding his conversation with the couple, Preston caught the eye of Mark Davis, one of his newer sales associates, and discreetly nodded toward Frank. The young salesman hesitated, glancing between Preston and the elderly visitor with visible uncertainty before reluctantly approaching Frank. "Oh, good morning, sir," Mark said, his tone professional, though noticeably cooler than the enthusiastic greeting he had offered to previous visitors. "Is there something specific I can help you with today?" Frank smiled warmly, extending his hand. "Morning, young man. Name's Frank Miller. I'm looking to replace my truck, and my granddaughter suggested I check out what you folks have to offer before making a decision." The salesman briefly shook Frank's hand. "I see. Well, this particular model starts at $67,000, and this is actually our most accessible offering. Most of our inventory begins in the $80,000 to $90,000 range." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "That's quite an investment. My current truck's been with me 23 years. If I'm going to spend that kind of money, I'd want something that'll last at least that long. What kind of longevity are these vehicles designed for?" The question seemed to catch Mark off guard. "Well, they're not really. I mean, most of our clients upgrade every few years to enjoy the latest features and styling." He glanced toward Preston, who was now watching their interaction with visible disapproval. "Perhaps you might be more comfortable at the Midwest Auto Dealership. Down the highway, they carry more practical options." Frank appeared unfazed by the suggestion. "I'm already here, and I've got time today. My farm's just up the road, the old Miller place on County Line. Been there since my grandfather's time. Mind if I look at that blue sedan over there? My granddaughter drives something similar for her job in the city." Before Mark could respond, Richard Preston approached, smoothly inserting himself into the conversation. "Mark, the Wilsons need your assistance with their financing options." He turned to Frank with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Richard Preston, owner of Pinnacle Automotive. How can I be of assistance?" Frank offered his hand again. "Frank Miller, pleased to meet you. Just looking at your vehicles here. Fine-looking machines." Preston briefly touched Frank's hand rather than giving it a proper shake. "Indeed they are. Our vehicles represent the pinnacle of automotive engineering and luxury, designed for discerning clients with particular lifestyle requirements. What exactly brings you to our showroom today, Mr. Miller?" "Well, I'm considering replacing my pickup," Frank explained, gesturing toward the parking lot where his weathered farm truck was visible among the luxury vehicles and SUVs. "Served me well for over 2 decades, but my son and granddaughter think it's time I got something safer with fewer miles on it." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thought I'd see what options might be available. Preston's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see. While we appreciate your interest, I should mention that our vehicles represent significant investments. The maintenance and insurance requirements alone are quite substantial. Perhaps you're unaware, but these automobiles require premium fuel, specialized service, and typically depreciate rather quickly if not properly maintained." Frank's expression remained pleasantly neutral. "I understand luxury comes with responsibilities. Before I retired from active farming, I maintained equipment worth more than some of these vehicles. Good maintenance is something I believe in. It's why my truck has lasted this long. A couple entered the showroom dressed in the business attire, and Preston's attention immediately shifted. If you'll excuse me, Mr. Miller, please feel free to look around, but I must attend to some clients. Mark can answer any initial questions you might have when he's available. With that, Preston moved swiftly toward the new arrivals, his demeanor transforming as he greeted them warmly. Left alone momentarily, Frank continued his slow circuit of the showroom, occasionally stopping to examine a particular vehicle more closely. He paid special attention to the engineering details rather than the luxury appointments, bending to look at undercarriages and engine compartments when possible. His movements were deliberate and respectful, never touching the vehicles without permission. After about 15 minutes, Frank approached the cafe area where a young woman was arranging cups. "Excuse me, miss. Is it possible to get a brochure with detailed specifications for that blue sedan? I'd like to research it a bit more thoroughly." The woman glanced toward Preston, who was now deep in conversation with the business couple in the consultation room. "Of course, sir. I'll have someone bring that to you. Would you care for a coffee while you wait?" "That would be mighty." "Oh, kind, thank you," Frank replied, settling into one of the minimalist chairs that was slightly too low for comfortable access with his arthritic knee. As Frank waited, Preston concluded his meeting and emerged from the consultation room. Immediately, noticing the elderly farmer in the cafe area, his expression darkened as he strode purposefully across the showroom, intercepting the employee before she could deliver Frank's coffee. After a brief exchange, Preston approached Frank directly. "Mr. Miller, I notice you've been in our showroom for some time now. While we appreciate your curiosity, I should mention that we typically operate by appointment, particularly during our busiest hours." Frank looked up with mild surprise. "I don't mean to impose. I was just waiting for some information on that blue model. Then I'll be on my way." Preston's voice took on a more definitive tone. "Our sales associates are currently occupied with scheduled clients. Perhaps it would be better if you made an appointment to return at a more convenient time." He glanced meaningfully toward the exit. "We can certainly mail any brochures to your home address." Frank slowly rose to his feet, wincing slightly as his knee straightened. "I understand you're busy, but before I go, I wanted to ask about that sedan's transmission system. My neighbor bought a similar model last year from your dealership in Glendale, and he's had some trouble with the shifting mechanism. I was wondering if that's been addressed in the newer models." Preston's carefully maintained composure began to slip. "Sir, I'm not sure what you think you're accomplishing here, but this is clearly not the appropriate dealership for someone in your situation. We deal in luxury vehicles for successful professionals, not basic transportation." "I'm simply asking about a known mechanical issue," Frank replied calmly. "I worked as a mechanical engineer before taking over my family's farm. Transmissions have always been a particular interest of mine." Preston stepped closer, lowering his voice, though still audible to those nearby. "Mr. Miller, let me be direct. You're wasting our time and yours. We both know you didn't come here to purchase an $80,000 vehicle. Perhaps you're lonely or bored, but this isn't a public park or a community center." Frank maintained his dignified composure. "I came here as a potential customer, same as anyone else. My financial situation isn't something you can determine by looking at my clothes or my truck." "I've been in this business for 25 years, Preston replied coldly. "I can tell the difference between a serious buyer and someone looking for a free coffee and a warm place to sit." He gestured toward the door. "Now, I'd appreciate it if you'd free up space for our actual clients." The showroom had grown uncomfortably quiet, with other customers and employees pretending not to notice the confrontation while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. Frank stood quietly for a moment, his weathered face showing no anger, just a hint of disappointment. "I suppose I have taken enough of your time," he finally said, replacing his cap on his silver hair. "Though you might be interested to know that I came here specifically to purchase a vehicle for my granddaughter as a graduation present. She starts her medical residency next month." Preston's expression flickered briefly before hardening again. "If that were true, she would be here herself, or you would have mentioned it immediately. Security will see you out." He nodded toward a uniformed guard who had appeared near the entrance. As the security guard approached, Preston delivered his final dismissal, voice raised enough to carry across the showroom. "You're wasting our time, old man. We cater to actual buyers, not dirt-poor farmers looking for a free coffee and a warm place to sit." A pained expression crossed Frank's face at this public humiliation, but he squared his shoulders and nodded politely to the security guard. "No need for an escort, son. I know my way out." His voice remained steady, though perhaps a bit quieter than before. As Frank walked toward the exit, he paused and turned back to Preston. "My father taught me that how you treat people who can do nothing for you reveals your true character. I hope that's not something you're teaching your own children." With those words, he walked out into the bright autumn sunlight, the glass doors closing silently behind him. In the parking lot, Frank stood beside his old truck for a moment, the keys in his hand, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. He watched as a young couple emerged from the dealership, speaking in hushed, uncomfortable tones as they glanced back at the building. They noticed Frank and offered sympathetic smiles before hurrying to their car. Frank climbed carefully into his truck, the seat molded to his form from decades of use. He sat quietly for a moment before pulling out his cell phone, a recent model, contrary to what many might expect from someone his age. He scrolled through his contacts and made a call. "David, it's Frank Miller. Yes, it's been too long. I'm doing fine. Just had an interesting experience at that new luxury car dealership in town." No, nothing like that. Just reminded me of that lieutenant we had in Da Nang, the one who couldn't tell a farmer from a banker if his life depended on it. Listen, I know you're busy with the base inspection tomorrow, but I was wondering if you might have time for coffee. You're coming through town anyway. That would be perfect. Yes, that's the place. They treated me like I was invisible the moment I walked in. No, don't go to any trouble. I just thought you might find it educational. Yes, 10 a.m. would be fine. Looking forward to catching up, General. As Frank ended the call, he didn't notice Richard Preston watching from the showroom window, a satisfied expression on his face as he observed the old farmer in his weathered truck. In Preston's mind, he had simply removed an unwelcome distraction from his premium retail environment. He had no way of knowing that his momentary satisfaction would evaporate completely by this time tomorrow. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect autumn day in Cedar Springs. At Pinnacle Automotive, the staff prepared for another day of carefully choreographed luxury sales. The vehicles gleamed under the showroom lights, coffee beans were ground for the day's first clients, and sales associates reviewed their appointments while Richard Preston conducted his morning briefing. "The Andersons will be here at 11 to finalize their purchase," Preston was saying to his assembled team. "Remember, they're adding the executive package to both vehicles, so ensure all the paperwork reflects the upgrades correctly. The Wilsons are still deciding between the SUV and the sedan. So, Mark, I want you to emphasize the limited availability of that particular color combination. Sometimes, a gentle sense of urgency helps clients make decisions." The staff nodded attentively as Preston continued through his list of instructions, emphasizing the importance of maintaining the showroom's pristine appearance and exclusive atmosphere. None of them mentioned the previous day's incident with the elderly farmer, though several had discussed it in whispered conversations before their boss arrived. Outside in the parking lot, the day proceeded normally for the first hour of business. A few customers arrived for scheduled appointments, and sales associates escorted them into the showroom with practiced cordiality. Richard Preston was in the middle of demonstrating the massage function of a driver's seat to a middle-aged executive when the distinctive sound of multiple heavy vehicles entering the parking lot drew everyone's attention. Through the showroom's vast glass frontage, they watched as 3 gleaming black suburban SUVs with government plates rolled into the parking area, followed by 2 military Humvees, their desert tan exteriors freshly washed to a polished sheen. The vehicles moved with precision, parking in a neat formation directly in front of the main entrance. For a moment, no one emerged, and the showroom fell into shocked silence. "What in the world?" Preston muttered, abandoning his demonstration mid-sentence as he moved toward the entrance, his expression a mixture of confusion and annoyance. The doors of the lead Suburban opened, and 2 military police officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp and their posture impeccable. They surveyed the area briefly before opening the rear door. From it emerged a tall, distinguished man in his early 70s, wearing the full dress uniform of a 3-star Army general. Despite his age, General David Thompson carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command, his chest adorned with rows of ribbons and medals that spoke of a lifetime of service. From the other vehicles emerged an assortment of military personnel and what appeared to be staff members in civilian attire, all moving with the coordinated efficiency of people used to working together under pressure. Among them was Frank Miller, dressed exactly as he had been the day before, looking somewhat embarrassed by the dramatic entrance, but walking alongside the general with the easy familiarity of old friends. Inside the showroom, Preston struggled to regain his composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed his staff and customers, "it appears we have some unexpected visitors. Please continue with your activities while I address this situation." His attempt at nonchalance was betrayed by the slight tremor in his voice. The showroom doors opened, and General Thompson entered first, flanked by 2 aides and followed by Frank Miller and several other military personnel. The general paused just inside the entrance, surveying the space with the practiced eye of someone who had assessed countless environments for strategic advantages. Preston stepped forward, attempting to take control of the situation. "Good morning, gentlemen. This is certainly an unexpected honor. I'm Richard Preston, owner of Pinnacle Automotive. How may I assist you today? Are you perhaps interested in our corporate fleet options?" General Thompson ignored Preston's outstretched hand, instead turning to Frank. "Is this the man you told me about, Frank?" Frank nodded. "That's him, David." The general turned back to Preston, his expression stern but controlled. "Mr. Preston, I'm General David Thompson, current Deputy Commander of Joint Special Operations Command. I understand you had a conversation with my friend Frank Miller yesterday." Preston's smile faltered as he glanced between the general and Frank. "We had a brief interaction, yes. I believe there was some confusion about our product offerings and target demographic." "There was no confusion on Frank's part," General Thompson replied, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "He came to your establishment as a potential customer and was treated with disrespect and ultimately removed from the premises." "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Preston began, his eyes darting to the growing audience of staff and customers who had abandoned any pretense of not listening. "We have certain protocols for appointments and clientele qualification." "I'm well versed in protocols, Mr. Preston," the general interrupted. "I'm also familiar with basic human decency. Frank Miller is not just any farmer from Cedar Springs. Before he took over his family farm, he served as a combat engineer in Vietnam, where he saved my entire unit by detecting an ambush that our intelligence had missed entirely." The general placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "After his military service, He worked as a mechanical engineer for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, helping develop vehicle systems that are still saving soldiers' lives today. When his father fell ill, he gave up a prestigious career to preserve his family's farm, which has been providing food for this community for 3 generations. Preston's face had drained of color. I had no way of knowing his background. You had no interest in knowing, General Thompson corrected him. You judged him by his appearance and his vehicle, not by his character or his capabilities. You called him, and I quote, a dirt-poor farmer looking for a free coffee and a warm place to sit. The showroom had gone completely silent. Everyone frozen in place as the confrontation unfolded. Even the gentle background music seemed to have faded away, though no one had adjusted the volume. Frank didn't call me to complain, the general continued. He called to invite me for coffee during my scheduled visit to the area. I'm here for a base inspection at Fort Ridgway, and Frank and I try to catch up whenever I'm in the region. He mentioned his experience here as an interesting anecdote, not as a grievance. The general turned to address the room at large. But as I've learned more details about the incident, I've become concerned about the business practices here. Frank came in with the intention of purchasing a high-end vehicle as a graduation gift for his granddaughter, Dr. Emily Miller, who just completed her medical degree at Johns Hopkins and is beginning her residency next month. He returned his gaze to Preston. Frank Miller may drive an old truck and wear work clothes, but he owns over 600 acres of prime agricultural land, has patents on 3 different mechanical systems used in modern vehicles, including, ironically, the adaptive suspension system in your flagship model, and has been on the board of directors of Cedar Springs National Bank for the past 15 years. Preston stood speechless, his carefully cultivated image of control completely shattered. Around the showroom, employees and customers exchanged glances of shock and, in some cases, barely concealed satisfaction at seeing the usually imperious dealer so thoroughly discomfited. General Thompson, Preston finally managed. I had no idea. If Mr. Miller had explained his situation, why should he have to? Frank spoke up, his voice calm but clear. I came in as a potential customer, same as anyone else. My bank account shouldn't determine whether I'm treated with basic courtesy. One of the military aides stepped forward, opening a leather portfolio. General, we have that information you requested about the Preston Automotive Group's federal e-contracts. Ah, yes. The general nodded. It seems your automotive group provides vehicles to several government agencies, including the Defense Department, through your location in Fairfield. Quite lucrative contracts, from what I understand. Preston's face, already pale, now took on an ashen quality. Those contracts represent a significant portion of our corporate business and require adherence to non-discrimination policies and ethical business practices, the general completed the thought. My staff will be conducting a review of those contractual obligations in light of yesterday's events. He turned to Frank. Now, I believe you wanted to look at a vehicle for Emily, something reliable and safe for her commute to the hospital? Frank nodded, a small smile finally breaking through his serious expression. That blue sedan caught my eye. Seemed like something that would serve her well. Excellent, the general replied, then looked back at Preston. Mr. Preston, I believe my friend is interested in making a purchase. I suggest you personally ensure he receives the highest level of service your establishment can provide. For a moment, Preston seemed frozen in place, the full implications of the situation crashing down around him. Then, with visible effort, he gathered the remnants of his professional demeanor. Of course, General, Mr. Miller, I would be honored to personally assist you today. Perhaps we could start fresh with a tour of our inventory. Frank exchanged a look with General Thompson, then nodded. I'd appreciate that, Mr. Preston, and maybe that coffee we talked about yesterday. Immediately, Preston agreed, signaling frantically to a staff member who rushed toward the cafe area. As the tense confrontation resolved into an awkward but functional sales interaction, the other military personnel dispersed throughout the showroom, some examining vehicles with genuine interest, others simply creating a presence that ensured Frank would receive fair treatment. General Thompson stepped aside with Frank for a moment as Preston hurried to prepare the paperwork for the blue sedan's demonstration drive. "You sure you want to buy from this character, Frank? We could go elsewhere." Frank considered the question seriously before answering. "I believe in second chances, David. You know that better than most. Let's see if Mr. Preston can learn something today. Besides, Emily really would like this particular model, and I'd rather not drive all the way to Glendale." The general chuckled. "Always practical. That's what saved our hides in Da Nang." He glanced over at Preston, who was now nervously explaining the sedan's features to one of the military aides. "Something tells me he's learning a valuable lesson about not judging books by their covers." Frank nodded, watching as the showroom gradually returned to normal activity, though with the unusual addition of military personnel examining luxury vehicles. Maybe next time he'll treat everyone who walks through that door with the same respect, regardless of what they're wearing or driving. "And if he doesn't," the general added with a knowing smile, "I hear his federal contracts come up for review next quarter." By the end of the day, Frank Miller had purchased the blue sedan for his granddaughter, negotiating a fair price with a chastened Richard Preston. The paperwork was processed efficiently, the vehicle was prepared for delivery, and arrangements were made for it to be delivered to Emily's apartment in the city the following week. As Frank and General Thompson prepared to leave, Preston approached. Then one final time, his demeanor markedly different from earlier in the day. "Mr. Miller, I owe you an apology. My behavior yesterday was inexcusable. I've spent so many years focusing on appearance and status that I've clearly lost sight of what truly matters." Frank studied the dealer's face, searching for sincerity. Beneath the practiced charm, "Apology accepted, Mr. Preston. I hope our interaction today serves as a reminder that worth isn't always visible on the surface." "A lesson I won't soon forget," Preston assured him, then turned to the general. "And General Thompson, thank you for your service and for this rather effective demonstration of why assumptions can be costly." As Frank and the general walked toward their vehicles, the elderly farmer glanced back at the gleaming dealership. "You think anything will really change in there?" The general considered the question as he watched Preston return to the showroom, already speaking animatedly to his staff. "Hard to say. Some people only learn when their livelihood is threatened. Others have genuine epiphanies. Time will tell which category he falls into." Frank smiled as he pulled out his phone. "I should call Emily and tell her about her new car. Though I might leave out the military escort part. She already thinks I cause too much excitement." "Speaking of which," the general said, with a mischievous glint in his eye, "was all this really necessary? You could have just mentioned your bank directorship yesterday and avoided the whole situation." Frank shrugged, the hint of a smile, playing at the corners of his mouth. "Where would be the educational value in that? Besides, it gave us a chance to catch up. Coffee next time might be a bit anticlimactic after today." As the military convoy prepared to depart, customers and staff watched from the showroom windows, the day's events already transforming into a story that would circulate throughout Cedar Springs for years to come. A tale about an elderly farmer, a luxury car dealership, and a powerful reminder that dignity and respect should never depend on appearances. Inside, Richard Preston gathered his sales team for an impromptu meeting, his typical arrogance noticeably subdued. Effective immediately, he announced, "We're implementing new customer service protocols. Every person who walks through those doors is to be treated with the same level of respect and attention, regardless of what they're wearing or driving. Is that understood?" As the staff nodded their agreement, Preston glanced out at the parking lot where Frank Miller was climbing into his old truck, the afternoon sun glinting off its weathered paint. Sometimes, the most valuable lessons came from the most unexpected teachers, and this was one lesson Preston wouldn't soon forget. The military convoy departed Pinnacle Automotive late that afternoon, leaving behind a profoundly changed atmosphere. Richard Preston stood at the vast glass entrance, watching the vehicles disappear down the county road, his mind still processing the extraordinary events of the day. Behind him, the showroom buzzed with hushed conversations among staff and lingering customers, all dissecting what they'd witnessed. The story was already spreading through Cedar Springs with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. "Everyone back to work," Preston announced sharply, turning to face his employees. "We still have a business to run." But the crisp authority that typically characterized his commands had diminished, replaced by a defensive edge that betrayed his discomfort. The sales associates scattered to their stations, exchanging knowing glances when their boss wasn't looking. Mark Davis, the young salesman who had first approached Frank Miller the previous day, lingered near the reception desk, visibly troubled. Preston noticed and approached him with narrowed eyes. "Something on your mind, Mark?" "Sir, I just wanted to say that I should have handled Mr. Miller differently yesterday. I contributed to the situation, and I apologize." Preston studied the young man's face for a moment before responding. "We all misjudged the situation. Learn from it and move on." He turned away, then paused and added, "Though I notice you weren't exactly rushing to defend him when I had security escort him out." Mark flushed with embarrassment. "No, sir, I wasn't. At least you're honest about it." Preston straightened, his already impeccable tie. "Now let's put this behind us. The Peterson family will be here in 20 minutes to finalize their purchase." But moving on proved more difficult than Preston anticipated. Throughout the remainder of the day, he noticed customers whispering when they thought he wasn't looking. Several seemed to be examining him with new eyes, measuring him against the morning's revelations. Even more troubling, 2 afternoon appointments called to cancel without explanation. By closing time, Preston's irritation had hardened into resentment. He was not accustomed to being humiliated, especially not in his own showroom. As he locked the main entrance, he couldn't help but glare at the spot where the military vehicles had parked, their precise formation still visible in his mind's eye. The drive to his colonial-style home in Cedar Springs' most exclusive subdivision did nothing to improve his mood. The prestigious house, like his tailored suits and luxury watches, had been carefully selected to reinforce the image he had cultivated over decades in the automobile business. Tonight, however, it felt less like an achievement and more like a fortress, a place to retreat from public scrutiny. His wife, Catherine, greeted him in the marble-floored entryway, her expression concerned. "Richard, what happened today? I've received 3 calls from friends asking if you were all right. Susan Henderson said something about military vehicles at the dealership." Preston shrugged off his cashmere overcoat with more force than necessary. "It was nothing. A misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion." "That's not what I heard," Catherine pressed, following him to the kitchen where he poured himself a generous measure of scotch. "Apparently, you insulted some local farmer who turned out to be connected to a military general. How is it that everyone in this town already knows about this?" Preston snapped, ice cubes clinking angrily against his crystal tumbler. "Because it's Cedar Springs," Catherine replied matter-of-factly, "and because according to Margaret Wilson, who was there, bringing in her car for service, you were quite publicly dressed down by a 3-star general." Preston stared into his drink. "I may have misjudged a customer." "Richard, fine. I was rude to an elderly farmer who came into the showroom. I didn't think he could afford our vehicles and I had him escorted out. It turns out he's quite Wealthy and friends with some general who decided to make a point by showing up with a military parade. Catherine watched her husband with a mixture of disappointment and concern. After 23 years of marriage, she was well acquainted with his drive for success and social standing, qualities that had initially attracted her but increasingly concerned her as they hardened into something less admirable. "You had an elderly man escorted out of your dealership because you didn't like how he looked?" she asked quietly. "He was disrupting the atmosphere," Preston defended, though his voice lacked conviction. "We cater to a specific clientele. You know that." Catherine shook her head slowly. "Your father ran that dealership for 30 years before you took over. I never once heard of him having anyone escorted out." "My father ran a different kind of business," Preston retorted. "Times have changed. We're not selling farm trucks to locals anymore. We're offering luxury experiences to executives and professionals. And apparently to bank directors who happen to be farmers," Catherine observed. "Richard, do you realize what this could do to our standing in the community? Cedar Springs isn't Chicago or New York. People have long memories. Here," Preston drained his glass in one swallow, "it'll blow over, everything does. Not in Cedar Springs it doesn't. Remember when Jason Thornton overcharged Mrs. Abernathy for her roof repair? That was 12 years ago, and people still bring it up." Before Preston could respond, his phone rang. Checking the display, he grimaced. "It's Robert Langley." The chairman of Preston Automotive Group's board of directors rarely called after business hours. The conversation was brief and one-sided, with Preston mostly listening and offering terse acknowledgements. When he ended the call, his face had lost some of its color. "The board is calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning," he informed Catherine, pouring another drink with a less steady hand. "Apparently, news of this incident has reached all 3 of our locations. Robert says our Fairfield dealership has already received inquiries about whether their government contracts might be affected." Catherine sighed. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. That dealership depends on those contracts." "I'm aware of that," Preston snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. "I'm sorry. It's been a long day." "I know." Catherine's voice softened. "But Richard, you need to think carefully about how you handle this. From what I've heard, this isn't just about one farmer. It's about how people perceive our relationship with the community. My grandmother used to say that reputations take years to build and seconds to destroy." Preston nodded absently, his mind already rehearsing explanations for the board. He had built the Preston Automotive Group from a single inherited dealership into a regional powerhouse with locations in 3 cities. He had transformed his father's modest business model into an enterprise that catered to the region's elite. He would not let one misjudgment threaten everything he had accomplished. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from Mark Davis. "Sir, just wanted to inform you that Mr. Miller's purchase has been finalized. Delivery to his granddaughter. Scheduled for Monday, as requested." Preston stared at the message for a long moment. Frank Miller had gone through with the purchase despite everything. He wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. Across town, in a modest farmhouse that had stood for over a century on the outskirts of Cedar Springs, Frank Miller sat on his porch enjoying the evening stillness. The old wooden rocker creaked rhythmically as he gazed out over fields now golden in the fading autumn light. Though he had scaled back active farming operations in recent years, leasing most of his acreage to neighboring farmers, he maintained a large garden and enough livestock to keep himself busy. The screened porch, built by his grandfather and meticulously maintained through generations, offered a perfect vantage point for watching sunset colors paint the western sky. It was Frank's favorite place for reflection, especially on days as eventful as this one had been. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Frank recognized the sensible sedan that belonged to his granddaughter Emily and smiled in Anticipation. She emerged from the car, dressed in the practical clothes she favored when not in medical settings. Jeans and a simple sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. At 28, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her purpose in life, a quality Frank had always admired. "There's my graduate doctor," he called as she climbed the porch steps. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Emily leaned down to hug him before settling into the adjacent rocker. "Grandpa, the entire hospital is buzzing about your adventure. Today, one of the nurses is married to someone who works at that car dealership. She says you showed up with an army." Frank chuckled. "Hardly an army, just David and some of his staff. They were passing through on their way to Fort Ridgeway anyway." "General Thompson," Emily corrected with mock severity. "Three-star General David Thompson, Deputy Commander of Joint Special Operations Command. You make him sound like the mailman." "David would prefer that, believe me," Frank replied. "Military formality always made him uncomfortable, even back in Vietnam." Emily studied her grandfather's face. "So, it's true. This dealer really threw you out yesterday and you came back with military backup?" Frank sighed. "It wasn't like that. I called David for coffee since he was coming through town. I mentioned what happened as a funny story, not expecting anything to come of it. He was the one who decided to make a point of visiting the dealership. With a military convoy," Emily added, unable to keep the amusement from her voice. "That was entirely his idea," Frank insisted, though his eyes twinkled. "I think he's been looking for excuses to make dramatic entrances since his last promotion." Emily laughed, then grew more serious. "But they really did kick you out because of how you were dressed?" Frank nodded. "The owner, Preston, made it clear that farmers with old trucks weren't their preferred clientele. Called me a dirt-poor farmer looking for free coffee right in front of everyone." Emily's expression darkened. "That's outrageous. You were going to spend $60,000 on a car for me and they treated you like that." "Well, to be fair, I didn't announce my intentions the moment I walked in," Frank conceded. "I wanted to look around first, see if I liked the place and the people. Your grandmother always said you can tell a lot about a business by how they treat people when they don't know who they're talking to." "Grandma was right about that," Emily agreed, reaching over to take his weathered hand in hers. "I'm sorry they were rude to you," Frank shrugged. "I've faced worse, though I admit being dismissed like that in public stung a bit. Reminded me of coming home from Vietnam, when some folks would cross the street rather than walk past someone in uniform." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening twilight. Frank had raised Emily after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12, and their bond ran deeper than most grandparent-grandchild relationships. She was as familiar with his stories and principles as she was with the contours of the farmland surrounding them. "So," Emily finally asked, "did you end up buying the car?" "I did," Frank confirmed. "The blue sedan we looked at online. They'll deliver it to your apartment on Monday." Emily looked surprised. "You still bought it from them, after how they treated you?" "The car's a good fit for you," Frank explained. "Excellent safety ratings, good visibility, all the modern features you wanted. Why should you have a lesser vehicle just because the dealer was rude to me?" "Because principles matter," Emily suggested. "You taught me that." Frank smiled. "I also taught you that forgiveness matters. That Preston fellow learned a valuable lesson today. Might stick with him better if I demonstrated some grace afterward." Emily shook her head in amazement. "You're something else, Grandpa. Most people would have taken their business elsewhere out of spite." "Most people haven't lived as long as I have," Frank replied simply. "You reach a point where you realize carrying grudges is just too heavy a load. Besides, after today's spectacle, I suspect Mr. Preston will ensure you receive exceptional service moving forward." Emily laughed again. "I can't believe General Thompson actually showed up with a convoy. That's so excessive. David always did have a flair for the dramatic. Should have seen him back in Da Nang, reorganizing our entire base after an inspection went sideways. The man can't resist making an entrance. Frank's eyes grew distant with memory. Though I have to admit, the look on Preston's face when those vehicles pulled up was something to behold. They talked until darkness enveloped the farm completely, sharing stories and laughter beneath a canopy of stars that had witnessed generations of millers working the same soil. When Emily eventually rose to leave, promising to call after the car was delivered, Frank remained on the porch for a while longer. He considered the day's events with the perspective that 7 decades of life had granted him. The humiliation of yesterday had been answered with today's vindication, but Frank took little pleasure in another man's discomfort. What satisfied him was not Preston's embarrassment, but the possibility that the experience might lead to greater empathy, a quality the world always needed more of. As Frank finally rose to head inside, he thought about what he'd told Emily. Forgiveness was indeed easier than holding grudges. He hoped Richard Preston would discover that truth sooner rather than later. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, Richard Preston entered the conference room at Cedar Springs National Bank, where the Preston Automotive Group's board of directors had convened their emergency meeting. He had selected his most conservative suit for the occasion, aiming to project stability and confidence despite the circumstances. The 7 board members were already seated around the polished mahogany table, their expressions ranging from concern to openly disapproving. Robert Langley, the board chairman, sat at the head of the table reviewing documents through reading glasses perched on his nose. At 65, Langley had been Preston's father's attorney before helping transition the business to the younger Preston's leadership. His continued presence on the board provided a connection to the company's history that many clients valued. Richard, Langley greeted without rising. "Thank you for joining us promptly. Please, have a seat." Preston nodded to the board members as he took his place, noting that several avoided direct eye contact, never a good sign. "I appreciate you all taking time from your busy schedules," he began, "though I believe yesterday's incident has been somewhat overblown." Langley removed his glasses and fixed Preston with a steady gaze. "That's precisely what we need to determine. The board has received numerous calls expressing concern about the direction and values of Preston Automotive Group. As you know, public perception directly impacts our business model." "I understand that," Preston acknowledged, "and I'm prepared to address any concerns. There was a misunderstanding with a customer that escalated unnecessarily." "A misunderstanding?" repeated Meredith Collins, the board's newest member and CEO of a regional insurance company. "Is that how you characterize having an elderly veteran and community banker forcibly removed from your showroom?" Preston felt his face warming. "That's not exactly—" "We have 3 separate accounts from witnesses," Langley interrupted, consulting his notes. "All indicate that you personally instructed security to remove Mr. Frank Miller after calling him, and I quote, 'a dirt-poor farmer looking for free coffee and a warm place to sit.' Would you characterize that as accurate?" Preston hesitated, aware that his response would set the tone for the entire meeting. His instinct was to defend himself, to explain the context and circumstances that had led to his actions. But looking at the faces around the table, he recognized that such an approach would only deepen his predicament. "Yes," he finally admitted, "those were my words, and they were inexcusable. I misjudged Mr. Miller based on his appearance, and I responded in a manner inconsistent with our company values." The admission seemed to catch several board members by surprise. James Wilson, whose family had been Cedar Springs residents for 5 generations, leaned forward. "That's refreshingly direct, Richard, but it leads to an important question. What exactly are our company values? because many in the community are now questioning whether Preston Automotive still reflects the principles your father established. The reference to his father stung more than Preston expected. Lawrence Preston had built the original dealership on a foundation of community trust and straightforward dealing. He had sponsored Little League teams, served on charity boards, and known most of his customers by name. Richard had deliberately moved away from that model, positioning the business as more exclusive and aspirational, but he had never intended to abandon the underlying integrity his father had instilled. "Our values remain what they've always been," Preston asserted. "Customer service, quality, and integrity. I failed to live up to those values in my interaction with Mr. Miller, and I take full responsibility for that failure." Robert Langley nodded slowly, his expression still grave. "Taking responsibility is an appropriate first step, but we need to discuss the potential ramifications of this incident, which extend beyond a single customer interaction." He slid a folder across the table. "This contains preliminary reports from our 3 locations. The Fairfield dealership has received inquiries from the Defense Logistics Agency regarding our compliance with non-discrimination policies tied to our government contracts. 2 corporate fleet clients have requested postponement of their quarterly meetings, and our social media accounts have received hundreds of negative comments, many from individuals who have never been our customers." Preston reviewed the documents with growing concern. The situation was worse than he had anticipated. "What actions is the board considering?" he asked directly. Meredith Collins answered, "That depends largely on your proposed response, Richard. This incident has created a significant reputation crisis. How do you intend to address it?" Preston had spent much of the night considering this very question. His initial anger had gradually given way to a more pragmatic assessment of the situation. While his pride remained wounded, his business instincts recognized the need for decisive action to mitigate the damage. "I believe we need a 3-pronged approach," he began, straightening in his chair. "First, a personal apology to Mr. Miller. Not a form letter or corporate statement, but a face-to-face acknowledgement of my error. Second, a review and revision of our customer service protocols across all locations, emphasizing respectful treatment regardless of perceived purchasing power. And third, a community engagement initiative that reconnects Preston Automotive with the values my father established while maintaining our current market position." The board members exchanged glances, several nodding approvingly. Robert Langley removed his glasses again. A gesture Preston had learned indicated thoughtful consideration. "Those are constructive suggestions," Langley acknowledged. "But I think we need to be more specific about what community engagement entails. The Preston name has taken a significant hit in terms of local goodwill." James Wilson cleared his throat. "If I might make a suggestion, Lawrence Preston was known for his support of agricultural programs in the county. Given that our flagship dealership now sits on what was once farmland, perhaps there's an opportunity to honor that heritage while demonstrating a commitment to the community's roots." The irony of focusing on agricultural programs after his dismissal of a farmer wasn't lost on Preston, but he recognized the strategic wisdom in the suggestion. "I'm open to exploring that direction," he agreed. "Perhaps a scholarship program for students pursuing agricultural sciences or support for the county's 4-H programs." For the next hour, the board discussed various approaches to rebuilding Preston Automotive's community standing. By the meeting's conclusion, they had outlined a comprehensive plan that balanced remediation of the immediate crisis with longer-term reputation management. Preston would retain his leadership position, but with the understanding that the board would be taking a more active role in oversight of customer service policies. As the meeting adjourned, Robert Langley asked Preston to remain behind. The other board members had departed. The older man studied Preston with the same penetrating gaze he had used in countless negotiations. "Your father would have been disappointed by what happened yesterday," Langley said without preamble, "but I think he would approve of how you're handling the aftermath." Preston hadn't expected the personal observation, and it caught him off guard. "Thank you, Robert. That means a great deal." Lawrence understood something fundamental about business in a community like Cedar Springs, Langley continued. "People don't just buy cars here, they buy relationships, trust. When your father sold someone a vehicle, he wasn't just completing a transaction, he was strengthening a connection to that family, often spanning generations." "I know," Preston acknowledged. "I've moved away." And from that approach, focusing more on lifestyle and exclusivity, which has been profitable, Langley conceded. But at what cost to the foundation Lawrence built? "Yesterday may have been a painful lesson, Richard, but perhaps it's one you needed." The older man gathered his papers and rose to leave. "One last thing. Frank Miller isn't just any community banker. He sits on the loan committee that reviews commercial lending applications, including the refinancing of your inventory floor plan that's coming up next quarter." Preston felt a chill at this new information. The floor plan financing was critical to the dealership's operations, allowing them to maintain their extensive inventory without tying up capital. "I'm not suggesting Frank would let personal feelings influence his professional judgment," Langley added, seeing Preston's expression. "By all accounts, he's a man of considerable integrity. But it illustrates why maintaining positive community relationships isn't just good citizenship, it's good business." With that sobering observation, Langley departed, leaving Preston alone in the conference room to contemplate not just the day's decisions, but the entire direction of his business philosophy. Later that afternoon, Preston found himself driving slowly past the Miller farm on County Line Road. He had debated whether a direct visit was appropriate or if he should call first, but ultimately decided that showing up in person demonstrated a level of respect and commitment to making amends. Still, as he turned into the long gravel driveway, he felt uncharacteristically nervous. The farmhouse came into view around a gentle bend, its white clapboard siding and wraparound porch gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The property, though clearly old, was immaculately maintained, with neat flower beds and well-tended shrubs, framing the approach. Beyond the house, Preston could see several outbuildings, their red paint a traditional contrast to the white of the main dwelling. As he parked beside a modest garden, Preston noticed Frank Miller working among rows of late-season vegetables, a wicker basket at his feet gradually filling with harvest. The elderly farmer straightened as Preston exited his vehicle, shading his eyes against the sun to identify his visitor. Recognition dawned on Frank's face, followed by what Preston was surprised to identify as simple curiosity rather than hostility. "Mr. Preston," Frank called, setting down his garden tools. "This is unexpected." Preston approached, suddenly conscious of his expensive shoes on the unpaved ground. "Mr. Miller, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Frank replied, gesturing toward the porch. "I was just finishing up here. Care to join me for some iced tea? Beeswax. Wife made it this morning." The casual hospitality caught Preston off guard. He had prepared for defensiveness or cool politeness, not this straightforward welcome. "That would be very kind, thank you." As they settled into the wooden rocking chairs on the porch, Preston surveyed the surrounding landscape with new eyes. The property commanded a view of rolling fields stretching toward distant woodlands, the terrain gentler and more appealing than he had ever noticed from the highway. Frank returned from inside with 2 tall glasses of tea, condensation already, beading on their surfaces in the warm afternoon. "So," he said, handing one to Preston before taking his seat, "what brings the owner of Pinnacle Automotive out to my humble farm?" The absence of pretense in the question made Preston's carefully prepared speech seem suddenly inadequate. "Mr. Miller, I've come to apologize for my behavior yesterday. My words and actions were inexcusable, and I am deeply sorry for the disrespect I showed you." Frank sipped his tea thoughtfully before responding. "Apology accepted, Mr. Preston. We all have days when we don't show our best selves." "You're very gracious," Preston acknowledged, "especially considering the public nature of the incident." Frank chuckled softly. "Well, David did make quite a production of it. He always did have a flair for the dramatic, even back in our military days." "About that," Preston ventured, "I had no idea of your background or your relationship with General Thompson." "Would it have made a difference?" Frank asked, his blue eyes sharp despite his age. "If I'd been wearing a suit instead of work clothes, or if I'd announced my banking position or military service when I walked in?" The question cut to the heart of the matter, and Preston found himself answering with unexpected honesty. "Yes, it would have. And that's precisely what I've been forced to confront since yesterday. I judged you based entirely on superficial factors, and in doing so, I violated the most basic principles of respect." Frank nodded slowly. "That's a valuable recognition, Mr. Preston. Many never reach it." They rocked in silence for a moment, the only sounds coming from birds in nearby trees and the distant lowing of cattle. Preston was struck by the peacefulness of the setting, so different from the controlled environment of his showroom, yet possessing its own distinct quality of elegance. "Your farm is beautiful," he observed. "How long has it been in your family?" "Since 1887, Frank replied with evident pride. "My great-grandfather purchased the original 80 acres after immigrating from Germany. Each generation has added to it. We're up to 640 acres now, though I lease most of it to neighboring farmers since my retirement." Preston did a quick mental calculation. At current land values, the property represented a substantial fortune, completely belying his assumptions about Frank's financial situation. "I understand you worked as an engineer before returning to farming." "For about 15 years, Frank confirmed. "After Vietnam, I used the GI Bill to get my degree in mechanical engineering, worked for the Defense Department for a while, then a private contractor developing agricultural equipment. When my father's health declined, I came back to take over the farm." The complexity of Frank's life story made Preston's earlier dismissal seem even more shallow. This was a man who had balanced multiple careers, served his country, and maintained a family legacy spanning over a century. Yet Preston had reduced him to a dirt-poor farmer based on his clothing and vehicle. "Mr. Miller," Preston began. "Again, beyond my personal apology, I wanted to let you know that Preston Automotive will be implementing new customer service protocols to ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. Additionally, we're establishing a scholarship program for students pursuing agricultural sciences at the county college, named in honor of your service to both the military and the agricultural community." Frank raised his eyebrows. "That's quite a response." "It's the right response," Preston replied. "My father built our business on community trust and respect. I've drifted from those values in pursuit of a more exclusive image, but yesterday made me realize the cost of that drift." "Your father was Lawrence Preston?" Frank asked. When Preston nodded, Frank smiled. "I bought my first new truck from him in 1976. He spent 2 hours making sure I understood every feature and got exactly what I needed for the farm, then threw in a bedliner at no charge. Good man." The connection surprised Preston. "You knew my father?" "Cedar Springs was a smaller place then," Frank explained. "Most of us local farmers bought from Lawrence because he treated everyone the same, whether you were buying a work truck or the fanciest car on his lot." The observation echoed what Robert Langley had said earlier about Preston's father understanding the importance of relationships. For the first time, Preston felt a twinge of something deeper than professional embarrassment about the incident, a sense that he had not just mistreated a customer but betrayed an important legacy. "I've lost sight of some important principles," Preston admitted. "Yesterday was a painful but necessary reminder." Frank studied him for a moment before responding. "You know, Mr. Preston, in farming there's something we call course correction. When you're plowing a field, if you focus too much on what's directly in front of your tractor, you'll end up with crooked rows. You need to pick a distant point, a tree or fence post on the horizon, and steer toward that. When you notice you're drifting off course, you don't berate yourself, you simply adjust your direction." Preston considered the metaphor. "And what would you suggest as my fixed point on the horizon?" "That's for you to decide," Frank replied, "but I'd recommend something more enduring than quarterly sales figures or profit margins. Those are important, certainly, but they make poor guiding stars." As the conversation continued, Preston found himself increasingly drawn to Frank's perspective. The elderly farmer spoke with the quiet wisdom of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of many trends while adhering to timeless principles. When Preston finally rose to leave an hour later, he felt he had gained not just valuable insights, but perhaps the beginning of a genuine connection. "Thank you for your time and your forgiveness, Mr. Miller," Preston said as they shook hands on the porch steps, "and for the tea." "Frank, please," the older man insisted, "and you're welcome at my farm any time, Richard. Perhaps next time you can meet my granddaughter when she visits with her new car." Preston nodded, smiling. "I'd like that. And please don't hesitate to contact me personally if she has any questions or needs regarding the vehicle." As Preston drove back toward town, he found himself seeing Cedar Springs with fresh eyes. The community he had increasingly viewed as merely a market for his products was revealed as a complex tapestry of interconnected lives and histories. Frank Miller was not an isolated case, but representative of the depth and substance that existed beneath the surface of the small town. For the first time in years, Preston felt a renewed connection to the business his father had built and the values that had sustained it through decades of economic changes. The path forward would require more than superficial adjustments to customer service protocols. It would demand a fundamental reconsideration of how Preston Automotive Group engaged with the community it served. As he approached the gleaming showroom of Pinnacle Automotive, now catching the late afternoon sun, Preston made a decision. Tomorrow, he would visit his father's grave at Cedar Springs Cemetery, something he had neglected to do for far too long. It was time to reconnect with the principles that had built the Preston name, principles temporarily forgotten, but not yet lost. 3 months after the incident at Pinnacle Automotive, Cedar Springs welcomed winter with the first significant snowfall of the season. Downtown storefronts displayed holiday decorations, and the town square glittered with thousands of white lights wrapped around bare-branched trees. The community had settled into its annual rhythm of winter preparations and festive gatherings. Though conversations still occasionally turned to the day the military came to Preston's dealership, now a firmly established piece of local law. At Pinnacle Automotive, the physical space remained as pristine as ever, with polished floors reflecting the gleam of luxury vehicles arranged throughout the showroom. But observant visitors noticed subtle changes. The by appointment recommended sign had disappeared from the entrance. The previously minimalist waiting area now featured a wall displaying photographs of Cedar Springs' agricultural history, including several black and white images of early automobile dealerships serving the farming community. Most significantly, the staff's approach to visitors had transformed, with equal attention given to everyone who entered, regardless of appearance or perceived purchasing power. Richard Preston moved through the showroom on a busy Saturday morning, observing these changes with quiet satisfaction. The past months had been challenging, requiring him to re-evaluate practices and principles he had taken for granted for years. The board-mandated customer service overhaul had initially felt like punishment, but as Preston implemented the changes, he discovered unexpected benefits. Sales had actually increased across all price points, and customer satisfaction metrics showed marked improvement. "Mr. Preston," called Mark Davis from the front desk, "the Miller party is here for the vehicle service appointment." Preston looked up to see Emily Miller entering the showroom, bundled against the December cold. Behind her came Frank Miller, his tall frame slightly stooped against the winter wind, and a young man Preston hadn't met before. "Dr. Miller?" Preston greeted Emily, extending his hand. "Good to see you again. I trust the sedan is performing." "Well," Emily shook his hand with a professional smile. "Very well, thank you. Just in for the scheduled maintenance check." "Excellent." Preston turned to Frank. "Good morning, Frank. Always a pleasure to have you visit us." In the months since their conversation on Frank's porch, Preston had made a point of personally handling any matters related to Emily's vehicle, gradually building a cordial, if not warm, relationship with the Miller family. What had begun as strategic reputation management had evolved into genuine respect, particularly as Preston learned more about Frank's contributions to the community. "Morning, Richard," Frank replied, stamping snow from his boots. "Let me introduce. My grandson, Michael Miller. He's home on leave for the holidays." The young man beside Frank stepped forward, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "Captain Michael Miller, sir. Army Corps of Engineers, currently stationed at Fort Leonard Wood." Preston shook Michael's hand, noting the family resemblance in his direct gaze and steady presence. "Thank you for your service, Captain. Your grandfather has mentioned your engineering work. Most impressive." "Thank you, sir. Just following in my grandfather's footsteps, though with more modern equipment." As Preston arranged for Emily's vehicle to be serviced, he noticed Frank observing the changes to the showroom with interest. "You've made some adjustments since my last visit," the elderly farmer remarked, gesturing toward the historical display. "Yes," Preston acknowledged. "We thought it was important to recognize our roots in the community. Several of those photographs came from the Historical Society archives." Frank stepped closer to examine a particular image. "That's my father's first tractor," he said, pointing to a photograph from the 1950s showing a young farmer proudly standing beside a new piece of equipment. "Purchased it from Lawrence Preston. Your father personally delivered it to our farm on a flatbed truck because we couldn't get into town that week due to flooding." Preston hadn't known this specific connection when selecting the photographs. "I had no idea that was your father. The Historical Society simply identified it as local farmer with new equipment." "History tends to simplify things," Frank observed. "Reduces people to generic categories rather than individuals with stories." The observation struck Preston as particularly relevant to his own journey over recent months. He had spent years categorizing potential customers, making swift judgments based on appearance and perceived wealth. The practice had seemed efficient and profitable, but he now recognized its fundamental flaws. "You're absolutely right," Preston agreed, "and that's something we're working to change here." While Emily's car was being serviced, Preston personally gave Michael a tour of the showroom, answering his questions about the latest automotive technologies with genuine enthusiasm. The young officer's engineering background led to a detailed discussion of propulsion systems that Preston found unexpectedly engaging. "Your grandfather mentioned you're on leave for 2 weeks?" Preston asked as they examined a hybrid model's engine compartment. "Yes, sir. First extended leave in 18 months. I've been overseeing infrastructure projects in Eastern Europe." "That must be challenging work." Michael nodded. "It is, but rewarding. Building bridges, literally and figuratively." "Preston, Was struck by the parallels between the young officer's comment and his own recent efforts to rebuild connections within the Cedar Springs community. Your grandfather has quite a legacy in this town. You and your sister both carrying it forward in different ways. That's kind of you to say, Michael replied, though Grandpa would insist he's just done what needed doing. He's never been one for recognition. This aligned with what Preston had come to understand about Frank Miller, a man whose substantial contributions to Cedar Springs had always been made quietly, without fanfare. The contrast with Preston's own carefully cultivated public image could hardly have been more pronounced. As the Millers prepared to leave with Emily's serviced vehicle, Preston found himself reluctant to see the interaction end. "Before you go," he said, "I wanted to mention that Preston Automotive Group is hosting our annual holiday gathering for clients and community partners next Friday evening. We would be honored if all of you would attend as my personal guests." Emily and Michael glanced at their grandfather, clearly deferring to his judgment given the history between him and Preston. Frank considered the invitation for a moment before nodding. "That's very kind of you, Richard. I expect we could manage that, assuming the weather cooperates." "Excellent. It's nothing formal, just an opportunity to express our appreciation to the community that supports us throughout the year." After the Millers departed, Preston returned to his office, reflecting on the interaction. What had begun as a strategic effort to repair his reputation had gradually evolved into something more genuine. He still found himself occasionally slipping into old habits of judgment, but each interaction with Frank Miller served as a reminder of the dangers of superficial assessment. The holiday gathering Preston had mentioned represented the culmination of Preston Automotive Group's community re-engagement strategy. Traditionally restricted to high-value clients and business partners, this year's event had been reimagined as a more inclusive celebration, with invitations extended to a broader cross-section of the Cedar Springs community. The board had initially questioned the expanded guest list, concerned about diluting the exclusive atmosphere, but Preston had persuaded them that rebuilding community goodwill required more than token gestures. As Preston reviewed the final arrangements for the gathering later that week, a knock at his office door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called, looking up to find Mark Davis standing in the doorway. "Sorry to disturb you, sir," the young salesman said, "but I thought you'd want to see this immediately." He placed a newspaper on Preston's desk, folded to display a prominent article. Preston's stomach tightened as he read the headline, "Cedar Springs Bank announces major expansion, Miller to head agricultural division." The accompanying photograph showed Frank Miller alongside the bank's president at a press conference. Scanning the article quickly, Preston felt a wave of relief as he confirmed the development had no direct connection to Pinnacle Automotive. The announcement concerned Cedar Springs National Bank's launch of a specialized agricultural lending division focused on supporting local farming operations with innovative financing solutions. "Thanks for bringing this to my attention, Mark," Preston said. "It's good news for the community and particularly for local farmers." "I thought so too, sir," Mark agreed. "But there's something specific I wanted you to notice." He pointed to a paragraph near the end of the article. Preston read the indicated section, which quoted Frank Miller discussing the new division's philosophy. "Too often, agricultural clients are judged by superficial factors rather than the substance of their operations and character. Our approach will focus on understanding the complete picture of each farming enterprise, recognizing that appearances can be misleading in either direction." Though Frank had not mentioned Pinnacle Automotive or Preston by name, the implied connection to their confrontation months earlier was unmistakable to anyone familiar with the incident. Preston was surprised to find himself smiling rather than offended. "He's absolutely right," Preston acknowledged. "And he's found a perfect way to transform a negative experience into something constructive for the community. Mark seemed relieved by this response. "I'm glad you see it that way, sir. I was worried it might seem like he was taking a public shot at us. 3 months ago, I probably would have seen it that way," Preston admitted. "But Frank Miller isn't the type to hold grudges. He's using his platform to advocate for a principle, not to settle a score." After Mark departed, Preston remained contemplative, staring out his office window at the snow-covered landscape of Cedar Springs. Frank Miller's new position would significantly increase his influence within the local business community, potentially affecting Preston Automotive Group in numerous ways. But rather than feeling threatened by this development, Preston found himself genuinely pleased for the elderly farmer whose dignity had so impressed him, even in the midst of public humiliation. Preston picked up his phone and dialed a number he now knew by heart. "Frank, Richard Preston here. Just read about your new position. Congratulations. It's well deserved, and the agricultural community will benefit tremendously from your leadership. Yes, we're still on for Friday evening. In fact, I was wondering if you'd be willing to say a few words at the gathering about the new agricultural division. It aligns perfectly with our commitment to supporting local farming operations through appropriate vehicle solutions." The conversation continued for several minutes, with both men discussing potential synergies between their respective organizations. When Preston finally hung up, he was struck by how naturally the exchange had flowed, without the strategic calculation that had characterized his initial apology visit to Frank's farm. Friday evening arrived with another light snowfall that transformed Cedar Springs into a picture-perfect holiday scene. Pinnacle Automotive's showroom had been temporarily reconfigured for the gathering, with the luxury vehicles arranged around the perimeter to create an open, central space. Catering staff circulated with trays of locally sourced refreshments, while subtle holiday music played through the state-of-the-art sound system. Preston greeted guests at the entrance, taking particular care to welcome those who might previously have felt out of place in the dealership's exclusive atmosphere. The guest list reflected the diversity of Cedar Springs: business owners and farm workers, professionals and tradespeople, long-time residents and newcomers, all mingling in an environment designed to emphasize their common connection to the community rather than their differences. When the Miller family arrived, Preston immediately introduced them to several key figures in the local business community, many of whom were already acquainted with Frank through his banking work. Emily and Michael integrated smoothly into conversations, their accomplishments in medicine and military engineering drawing genuine interest from other guests. As the evening progressed, Preston found himself observing the gathering with a sense of satisfaction that transcended the strategic goals that had initially motivated the event. The showroom buzzed with authentic conversation, neighbors connecting across traditional social boundaries in a way that felt both novel and somehow reminiscent of the community spirit his father had cultivated decades earlier. At a natural lull in the festivities, Preston tapped a glass to gain everyone's attention. "First, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. Your presence means more than you might realize." He paused, surveying the diverse gathering. "When my father founded Preston Motors in 1953, he established it as more than just a business. It was a community institution, a place where farmers and doctors, teachers and factory workers all received the same respect and attention." Preston noted several older attendees nodding in recognition. Over time, as our business evolved and expanded, some of that founding spirit was lost. We began to focus more on the vehicles we sold than the people we served. He allowed himself a self-deprecating smile. "Some of you may have heard about an incident earlier this year that rather dramatically highlighted this shift in priorities." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd, with several glances directed toward Frank Miller, who maintained a gracious expression. That experience, Preston continued, began as what I perceived as a professional embarrassment, but evolved into something much more valuable, an opportunity for growth, both personal and organizational. It reminded me of principles my father understood instinctively, that in a community like Cedar Springs, business success and community connection are inseparable. Preston gestured toward the historical display that now permanently adorned one wall of the showroom. These photographs represent not just our community's past, but its enduring values. They remind us that beneath the surface differences of occupation, income, or appearance, we share common needs and aspirations. Raised his glass. To Cedar Springs, not just as a market we serve, but as a community we belong to. As guests applauded and raised their glasses, Preston caught Frank Miller's eye across the room. The elderly farmer offered a slight nod of approval that meant more to Preston than the accolades of industry peers or the praise of the board. Later in the evening, as conversations flowed in smaller groups throughout the showroom, Preston found himself standing beside Frank near the historical display. "Your words were well chosen," Frank observed, "though I suspect they reflect more than just strategic messaging." "They do," Preston acknowledged. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past months about legacy, not just what we build, but what we leave behind. My father understood that intuitively, but it's taken me longer to grasp." Frank studied a photograph of downtown Cedar Springs from the 1960s. The street lined with holiday decorations, not unlike those currently adorning the town square. "Communities have long memories," he said. "They remember kindnesses and slights, fairness and injustice, often long after the individuals involved have forgotten the specifics." "I'm discovering that," Preston agreed. "When I first moved back to take over the dealership after my father's death, I saw Cedar Springs primarily as a stepping stone, a base from which to build something bigger, more sophisticated than what he had created. I was quite frankly somewhat embarrassed by the small-town nature of the business." Frank nodded without judgment. "Many of us go through a phase of wanting to transcend our origins. Some never return. Others come back with new perspectives." "And which were you?" Preston asked, genuinely curious. "Both at different times," Frank admitted. "After Vietnam and then my engineering career, I initially returned to the farm out of obligation to my father. I felt I was sacrificing greater opportunities to maintain something provincial." He smiled at the memory. "It took years for me to recognize that what I thought was a step backward was actually a movement towards something essential." This perspective resonated with Preston's recent journey. His efforts to elevate Preston Automotive above its community roots had seemed progressive and ambitious, but had ultimately disconnected the business from its founding purpose. The incident with Frank had initiated a painful but necessary course correction. "I've been considering a new direction for our business model," Preston shared. "Not abandoning our luxury market, there's still demand for that, but expanding our focus to include practical vehicles for agricultural and commercial clients, with service options specifically designed for working vehicles." Frank raised his eyebrows. "Returning to your father's approach?" "With contemporary adaptations," Preston clarified. "Modern financing options, technology integration packages designed for agricultural applications, maintenance plans that accommodate seasonal work schedules, essentially applying our premium service philosophy to practical transportation needs." "An interesting synthesis," Frank observed, "and potentially very valuable to the farming community. Vehicle expenses represent a significant portion of operational costs for most agricultural enterprises." "That's what our research indicates," Preston agreed. And given your new position heading the agricultural division at Cedar Springs National, there might be opportunities for collaborative approaches to financing. Or, as they discussed potential synergies between their organizations, Preston realized how dramatically his relationship with Frank had evolved from that confrontational first encounter. What had begun as a mortifying professional misstep had transformed into a catalyst for meaningful change in both his business approach and personal outlook. The gathering gradually thinned as families with children departed first, followed by those with longer drives home. Eventually, only a small group remained, including Preston, the Millers, and several members of the Preston Automotive management team. The conversation had shifted to community developments, with various proposals for addressing Cedar Springs' growing pains, discussed with the relaxed openness that comes after shared food and companionship. The challenge, observed Robert Langley, who had joined the conversation after arriving late from another commitment, is balancing growth with preservation. Cedar Springs needs economic development, but not at the expense of what makes it special. Michael Miller, who had been mostly listening until now, spoke up. In my engineering work overseas, we often face similar tensions. There's no universal formula for success, but the projects that work best are those where modern solutions are adapted to respect local conditions rather than imposed, regardless of context. Precisely, agreed Emily. In medicine, we're increasingly recognizing that standardized treatment protocols need to be modified based on individual patient factors. The most sophisticated approach is often not the most effective if it doesn't account for specific circumstances. Preston was struck by how the Miller siblings, though pursuing vastly different careers, shared their grandfather's thoughtful approach to complex problems. Neither rejected progress nor clung blindly to tradition. Both sought integration that honored context while embracing necessary change. I think that's the balance we're trying to strike with Preston Automotive's evolution, Preston contributed, maintaining the quality and service that defines our brand while reconnecting with the community-focused approach my father established. Frank, who had been quietly listening, added, "The most sustainable businesses in this region have always been those that grow with the community rather than despite it. Your father understood that intuitively, Richard." As the evening concluded and final goodbyes were exchanged, Preston found himself standing alone in the transformed showroom. The space now quiet, except for the soft holiday music still playing through the speakers. The cleaning crew would arrive in the morning to restore the dealership to its usual configuration, but for now, the room retained the energy of the gathering. Chairs arranged in conversational groupings, a few forgotten gloves and scarves waiting to be claimed by their owners. Preston moved through the space, turning off accent lights and adjusting the temperature controls for overnight. As he passed the historical display, he paused before a photograph he had included without fully appreciating its significance. Lawrence Preston, standing proudly beside the original Preston Motors building in 1953, his arm around a young man who must have been Robert Langley's father, based on the striking resemblance. The image captured something essential about his father's approach to business, the sense that commercial transactions were merely one aspect of deeper community relationships. Lawrence Preston had sold vehicles, certainly, but he had also built connections that transcended commerce, creating a legacy that remained meaningful decades after his death. Preston touched the frame gently, a gesture that felt like both acknowledgement and promise. "I understand now, Dad," he said softly to the empty showroom. "Better late than never, right?" Outside, snow continued to fall on Cedar Springs, covering luxury vehicles and farm trucks alike with the same quiet blanket of white. Nature, like the most enlightened human institutions, made no distinctions based on superficial characteristics. Preston thought of Frank Miller returning to his historic farmhouse, Emily to her medical career, Michael to his military service, each contributing to the community in different but equally valuable ways. As Preston locked the dealership doors and headed toward his car, he noticed Frank's quotation in the newspaper article that Mark had shown him earlier that week. Too often, agricultural clients are judged by superficial factors rather than the substance of their operations and character. The wisdom applied far beyond banking or automotive sales. It spoke to a fundamental human tendency that required constant vigilance to overcome. Preston started his car, the luxury vehicle responding with the purring precision of German engineering. As he navigated the snowy streets toward home, he reflected on the strange sequence of events that had led him to this moment of clarity. A confrontation born of prejudice and pride had evolved into reconciliation, then understanding, and finally appreciation. The dirt-poor farmer he had dismissed had become a valued colleague and, increasingly, a friend whose wisdom had helped reshape Preston's understanding of his own business and community. By the time Preston arrived home, a new idea had begun forming in his mind, one that synthesized his father's community focus with his own business innovations. Cedar Springs needed more than luxury vehicles or agricultural equipment. It needed transportation solutions that acknowledged both its traditional roots and evolving needs. Tomorrow, he would begin sketching out a comprehensive proposal for the board, one that honored his father's legacy while creating something distinctly his own. As Preston entered his home, greeted by the warmth and holiday decorations his wife had arranged, he felt a sense of purpose that transcended quarterly sales targets or market positioning. For the first time in years, perhaps since taking over his father's business, he was building something he genuinely believed in, rather than merely chasing abstract metrics of success. The transformation that had begun with humiliation in his showroom, watching Frank Miller maintain dignity in the face of disrespect, then witnessing the dramatic arrival of military vehicles the following day, had catalyzed a process of re-evaluation that continued to unfold in unexpected ways. What Preston had initially perceived as the most embarrassing professional episode of his career had ultimately become its most valuable turning point. In his home office, Preston opened his laptop and began typing notes for the next day's work. At the top of the document, he typed a title that captured the essence of his evolving vision: Preston Automotive Group, honoring tradition, embracing progress. Beneath it, he added a quote he had heard Frank Miller use during their conversation at his farm months earlier: "The measure of success isn't what you acquire, but what you contribute." The words seemed particularly fitting for the holiday season, a time when even the most commercially minded were reminded of deeper values. As Preston continued developing his notes, the snow outside blanketed Cedar Springs in a unifying whiteness, temporarily erasing the visible distinctions between luxury homes and modest farmhouses, between flagship dealerships and family-owned businesses, a visual reminder of the common humanity that Frank Miller had gently but persistently reminded him to recognize. Spring arrived in Cedar Springs with its usual transformation of the landscape. The snowdrifts that had dominated for months gave way to emerging greenery, and farmers throughout the county began their annual cycle of planting and cultivation. At Pinnacle Automotive, the changes were equally dramatic, though less visibly apparent to casual observers. The Preston Automotive Group board had initially received Richard Preston's comprehensive proposal with skepticism. The suggestion to launch a dedicated agricultural and commercial division alongside their luxury offerings seemed like a retreat from the exclusivity they had carefully cultivated. But Preston's detailed market analysis, combined with preliminary partnership arrangements with Cedar Springs National Bank's new agricultural division, eventually persuaded even the most doubtful members. As Preston surveyed the newly renovated, section of the dealership dedicated to farming and commercial vehicles, he felt a satisfaction that transcended mere business success. The space maintained the clean, professional aesthetic of Pinnacle Automotive, but incorporated practical elements specifically designed for agricultural clients. Concrete flooring that wouldn't show dirt tracked in from fields, comfortable seating, built to accommodate work clothes, and displays highlighting vehicle features relevant to farming operations. Most significantly, the staff for this division had been carefully selected not just for sales ability, but for knowledge of and connection to the agricultural community. Several had grown up on farms. One was a retired agricultural extension agent who brought decades of expertise to conversations about vehicle applications for specific farming needs. "Mr. Preston," called one of these new team members, "the first shipment of the specialized trucks has arrived. They're being prepped for display now." Preston nodded acknowledgement, already anticipating the community response to these vehicles, specifically designed for agricultural use, with modifications developed in consultation with local farmers, including Frank Miller. The collaboration had begun tentatively, but evolved into a genuine partnership, with Frank's practical knowledge complementing Preston's automotive expertise. As if summoned by this thought, the dealership doors opened to admit Frank Miller, moving more slowly than usual with the aid of a walking stick, a concession to arthritis exacerbated by the damp spring weather. Despite this physical limitation, his presence remained commanding, his observant gaze taking in the transformed space with evident interest. "Frank," Preston greeted him warmly. "Perfect timing. The special order vehicles just arrived." "That's what brings me by," Frank confirmed. "Wanted to see how they turned out after all our discussions." Preston led him toward the service area where the vehicles were being prepared. The manufacturer implemented most of our recommended modifications. The reinforced bedliners, extended fuel range, and specialized toolbox configurations are all as specified. They couldn't accommodate the alternative transmission cooling system you suggested, but they've promised to consider it for next year's models. Frank nodded, unsurprised. Large companies move slowly with innovations. My engineering days taught me that patience is essential when suggesting improvements to established designs. The vehicles themselves represented a significant departure from Pinnacle Automotive's typical inventory, not luxury SUVs or sleek sedans, but practical trucks, equipped specifically for agricultural applications. Yet they carried the same attention to detail and quality that characterized the dealership's high-end offerings, embodying Preston's vision of applying premium standards to practical needs. As they inspected the vehicles, other customers entered. The agricultural division, some clearly farmers based on their attire and weather-worn complexions. Preston observed with satisfaction that his new staff greeted them with the same respectful attention previously reserved for luxury clients. No one was assessed based on appearance or presumed purchasing power. Each received thorough, knowledgeable service. "You've made real changes here," Frank observed quietly, "not just cosmetic adjustments for public relations purposes." "The incident with you was a catalyst," Preston acknowledged, "but the evolution has taken on momentum of its own. We've discovered there's significant demand for high-quality, specialized vehicles in the agricultural sector. Customers who value expertise and service, but have been overlooked by dealerships focused exclusively on luxury or high-volume sales." Frank smiled slightly. "Sometimes the most valuable market segments are the ones others underestimate." The observation contained no overt reference to their first encounter, but the parallel was unmistakable. Preston had underestimated Frank based on superficial assessment, just as the automotive industry often underestimated the potential of the agricultural market. "Exactly," Preston agreed, And connecting with those markets requires more than just stocking different inventory. It demands a fundamental respect for the customers and their specific needs. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a middle-aged couple dressed in work clothes, clearly coming directly from farm labor. The woman approached Frank with a warm greeting. "Mr. Miller, good to see you out and about. Did that bank loan come through for the irrigation system?" "Indeed it did, Mrs. Johnson. All processed last week. You should be receiving the final paperwork any day now." She turned to Preston with a forthright assessment. "So you're the one who's finally brought decent farm vehicles back to Cedar Springs. About time. We've been driving 40 miles to Wilson County for years because nobody local catered to agricultural needs." Preston accepted both the criticism and opportunity implied in her comment. "We're working to change that, Mrs. Johnson. In fact, I'd value your perspective on these new arrivals." He gestured toward the specialized trucks. "We collaborated with several local farmers on the specifications, but additional input is always valuable." What followed was a detailed discussion of vehicle features with the Johnsons, who proved to be knowledgeable and precise in their assessment. Their comments reflected practical experience that no focus group or market research could fully capture. Observations about Dr. handle placement when wearing work gloves, visibility needs when towing agricultural equipment, and interior materials that could withstand the realities of farm work. Preston listened attentively, taking notes rather than defensively. Explaining design choices, Frank observed this interaction with quiet approval, noting how completely Preston's approach had transformed from their first encounter. The car dealer who had once dismissed a farmer based on appearance was now earnestly soliciting agricultural expertise, recognizing its value to his business evolution. As the Johnsons departed, promising to return with their son who needed a new work vehicle, Preston turned back to Frank. "This new division wouldn't exist without your influence, you. No, not just because of what happened between us, but because your insights shaped our understanding of what's truly needed in agricultural transportation." Frank demurred, uncomfortable with direct praise. "You'd have figured it out eventually. Smart business people recognize unmet needs sooner or later." "Perhaps," Preston allowed, "but there's a difference between recognizing an abstract market opportunity and understanding the human realities behind it. That's what you've helped us develop, not just a business strategy, but a deeper appreciation for the community we serve." As they continued their tour of the new division, Preston shared plans for upcoming initiatives, maintenance clinics designed specifically for agricultural vehicle owners, seasonal financing options aligned with farming income cycles, and a mobile service unit for emergency repairs during critical harvest periods. Each reflected not just commercial calculation, but genuine response to community needs. Their conversation eventually turned to family matters: Emily's progress in her medical residency, Michael's upcoming return from overseas deployment, and Preston's son, who was considering joining the family business after college. The easy exchange reflected how thoroughly their relationship had evolved, from adversary to collaborative colleagues, to something approaching friendship. As Frank prepared to leave, leaning more heavily on his walking stick after the extended tour, he paused near the historical display that had become a permanent fixture in the dealership. "You know," he observed, studying a photograph of the town's early agricultural development, "communities are ultimately shaped more by how we respond to mistakes than by the mistakes themselves." Preston considered this wisdom. "I like to think that's true for individuals as well." "Indeed," Frank nodded toward the photograph. "My grandfather once told me that the measure of a person isn't whether they stumble, we all do, but whether they help others up when they themselves have fallen." The philosophical observation seemed particularly fitting given their shared journey. What had begun with Preston causing humiliation had transformed into a relationship that benefited not just them as individuals, but the broader community they both served in different capacities. As Preston watched Frank drive away in his 20-year-old truck, still perfectly maintained despite its age, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. The most embarrassing professional episode of his career had ultimately catalyzed its most meaningful evolution, guiding Preston Automotive Group back to community-centered principles while maintaining the quality standards he had worked so hard to establish. Later that afternoon, as Preston reviewed preliminary sales figures for the new agricultural division, his assistant interrupted with news. "Sir, the Chamber of Commerce Selection Committee just called. They've chosen you as Business Leader of the Year for the Community Reinvestment Initiatives." Preston received this information with mixed emotions. The recognition was professionally gratifying, but he felt a twinge of discomfort at being celebrated for changes that had begun with his own very public failure of judgment. "Did they mention who nominated me for the award?" "Yes, sir. It was Frank Miller." This revelation left Preston momentarily speechless. That Frank would not only forgive the humiliation Preston had caused him, but actively advocate for his recognition demonstrated a generosity of spirit that transcended conventional business relationships. "Will you accept, sir? They need to know, in for the announcement." Preston nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll accept, but please contact the chamber and request that the award be presented jointly to Frank Miller and myself. The initiatives they're recognizing wouldn't exist without his influence and guidance." As his assistant departed to convey this request, Preston turned to gaze out his office window at Cedar Springs, spreading below the hillside location of Pinnacle Automotive. The town had changed significantly since his childhood, with new developments and businesses altering its profile. Yet its essential character remained, a community where relationships mattered more than transactions, where personal integrity still influenced professional standing, and where an elderly farmer in worn work clothes might carry more genuine influence than the owner of the region's most prestigious dealership. The lesson had been humbling, but invaluable. In a world increasingly defined by digital connections and virtual commerce, Cedar Springs offered a reminder that true business success ultimately depended on human relationships grounded in mutual respect. Preston had nearly forgotten this fundamental truth in his pursuit of exclusivity and status, but thanks to an unexpected confrontation and its remarkable aftermath, he had rediscovered principles that would guide not just his business practices, but his personal values moving forward. As spring blossomed fully across Cedar Springs, the new agricultural and commercial division of Preston Automotive Group flourished alongside it, not as a separate enterprise, but as an integrated expression of a business philosophy that had come full circle, honoring tradition while embracing progress, recognizing worth beyond appearances, and measuring success by contribution rather than acquisition. The transformation that had begun with humiliation had evolved into something neither Frank Miller nor Richard Preston could have anticipated that autumn day when their paths first crossed, a partnership that strengthened not just their respective enterprises, but the community they both called home. 1 year to the day after the incident, Frank Miller stood beside Richard Preston at the grand opening of Preston Miller Motors, Cedar Springs' first dealership specifically designed to serve both luxury clients and the agricultural community. The rebranded business featured a showroom divided into two distinct but equally respected sections. The luxury vehicles still gleamed under perfect lighting, but across the floor, practical farm trucks and equipment now received the same meticulous presentation. The partnership had shocked everyone in Cedar Springs, particularly those who had witnessed Frank's humiliation that autumn day. But the military convoy's visit had sparked something unexpected. Genuine conversation between two men who discovered they shared more values than either would have guessed. Preston brought business acumen and marketing expertise, while Frank contributed deep community knowledge and practical insight into the needs of agricultural customers. "Never would have predicted this outcome," General Thompson remarked, admiring the news sign featuring both men's names. "Thought I was just teaching someone a lesson about respect." "You did," Frank replied with a smile. "But the best lessons go both ways. Richard taught me something about forgiveness, and I suppose I taught him something about looking beyond appearances." Preston nodded, watching as customers from all walks of life mingled in the showroom. "My father always said the true measure of a business wasn't its profit margin, but its community impact. Took me too many years to understand what he meant." The three men watched as Emily Miller pulled up in her new sedan, the vehicle that had started it all. She stepped out carrying a cake decorated with the new dealership logo, her face bright with pride for her grandfather's unexpected new venture. "Ready to cut the ribbon?" Preston asked, turning to Frank. "Been ready my whole life," the elderly farmer replied. "Just needed the right partner to complete the picture." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.